Hello and assalamu alaikum everyone. Hope everyone's staying safe and healthy. Welcome to our second e-talk series. Thank you so much for hopping up today and listening to us. We hope that everybody is safe. We know that these are trying times, but then again, it has brought us a lot of opportunities, positive opportunities as well. One of it that we have realized over here is connecting to the world. So today we have Mr. Daniel Zender, all the way from Brooklyn, New York. He is a graphic designer and illustrator. Um, he is a versatile artist, printmaker, sculptor, uh, and a painter as well. He has won many awards. He has worked for Google, Nike, New York Times. He has a lot of renowned clients in his bag right now. So I welcome you, Mr. Daniel Zander. Welcome to our first eTalk series. Thank you so much for agreeing to doing this with us.
Hi, Afreen. Thank you. Thanks for introducing me. I'm excited to join you guys across the world and talk about some illustration and sketching stuff. So this is exciting for me as well.
Okay.
Should I take? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Go on.
Oh, okay. Should I take it away?
Okay, so before you start, so I want to add something for the audience. Everybody, you can actually bug us between the talks because Daniel wants a very interactive session. So what you can do is that you can bug us between the talks. You can chat. You can post your questions in the chat box, and we can keep on asking those questions to Daniel. So over to you, Daniel.
Okay, thank you. Before I start presenting my screen, I guess I just wanted to give a little overview of what I'll be discussing today and talk about just a few key elements that we'll be covering. When I was talking to Afreen about what I could present today, I became interested in talking about sort of my sketching and concepting process for illustration projects. So I thought it would be interesting to just kind of walk through how I start my research, sketching, and then eventually work on revised images and then final art. And this will all be based around an illustration that I made for the New York Times last year for their 40th anniversary cover, special issue for the science section. The theme of this project was 12 things we'd really like to know and a few we'd rather not. Questions in the science article included: why aren't there more vaccines available? Why are we always depressed? Will we survive in a hotter world? How did we get to be human? What are we in the multiverse, and what is all of this? Can we harness the immune system? Will our AI overlords be nice to us? Why are we getting fat, and how do we prevent dementia? We are not alone, and how are we going to meet the aliens? How long can humans live? And things we really don't want to know. So that was the overview of the brief that the New York Times supplied to me. So basically it was just this project that was really exciting for me to kind of tackle because it was very open-ended in how I could approach it. It was a bunch of different questions that scientists and people are asking about just humanity in 2019, which was the 40th anniversary of the science section of the New York Times. So I kind of wanted to talk about how I approached the project in general, because it's a very big project and one that I knew a lot of people were going to see, and I knew that it had to be a unique image. So let me go. I'm going to share my screen now and open up this slideshow. Afreen, will you let me know if you can see this?
Not right now.
Can you see this?
Nope.
Sorry. Okay. How about now?
Yeah, something is popping up.
Okay, great. Okay, so you can see this is the kind of overview of the cover. I've edited out the image because I didn't want to share what it was before we go through the entire process here. But again, this is the full page of the science for the New York Times, the science section, and this is the illustration size that I was asked to present. So you can see on the top it says November 14th, 1978, the New York Times began a weekly section about health and science. For 40 years now, Science Times has reported everything from climate change to genetics to gravitational waves. With this special issue, we look forward to seeing what the next decade brings. And then the title of this article was 11 Things We'd Really Like to Know and a Few We'd Rather Not Discuss. So again, I started my process on this by thinking about illustrations and science-related artwork that already exists in the world, because I think for me, when it comes like a project like this comes along, it's really important to kind of see what's cliche and been done and what people are expecting. And then it's also part of this research is also trying to figure out how these cliches can relate to the audience in new and interesting ways. So I'll touch on that more later, because there are elements from some of the stuff that I do like borrow and think about, but my main concern here is avoiding things that people have seen. So for in this first example that I pulled, it's a profile of a head made up of a lot of like science and technology related illustrations, vector art, that make like the profile of a person with a light bulb, you know, in their head. And something like this to me really, I don't know, it's the kind of thing I'm trying to avoid with my artwork, because I think it's really up to an illustrator or designer to share something new with them, with the audience. So that's what I'm looking for. So as I went through researching, you know, what is popular and trendy in science-related artwork, we see a lot of things that start to reoccur. Obviously, like DNA strands, microscopes, beakers, the people with lab coats. You can see that this is a completely different illustration, but pretty much the exact same subject matter and almost the same design, right? Probably different illustrator, different context, but still very related. There's not a lot of diversity in the people, and you know, I think there's interesting color choices in these, but beyond that, it's just kind of giving something to the audience that they already know and expect, right? There's more like trendy ways to approach this, where it's more of a stylized approach that maybe is a little bit more interesting visually, but conceptually still doesn't really, in my opinion, grab the audience in an interesting way. I think that like this is a very technically proficient image. Obviously, it's like well designed. But in terms of offering us something that kind of surprises the audience, I don't know that it really generally works. So you can see, again, repetition of microscope beakers, little butane flames, atoms, things like that. In a more complex image like this, we get to like see a little bit more, I would say, diversity in the design and the concept, where there's more interaction between all these things. But again, seeing the exact same stuff that we've seen in the previous images, right? Beakers, microscopes, planets, all of this stuff that we have, like the molecule or the DNA strand at the bottom. So I'm getting a sense now with this research that what to kind of avoid. Again, same thing. And then I just took a screenshot of everything on one page, and you can really see like, you know, even though these are different style, like visual aesthetic choices and color ranges and sort of compositions, what we see in general is a lot of the same stuff over and over again. So I do think that when I'm approaching an illustration project, especially one that's much larger for the New York Times or something like that, it's really important for me to figure out what kind of stuff to avoid before moving on to the next step, which is my sketches. When I start to also look at research for these projects, I look at more abstract things. So whenever, you know, there's related imagery that you can associate with any given subject matter, and a lot of it can be reappropriated or reused as textural or pattern, elements that sort of give the audience an impression of what they're looking at, but doesn't tell the whole story. So I started to look at like geology, what the insides of caves lit up looks like, and how they layer in space. What happens with like light through a prism, the refraction of light, the colors that are made in these like organic situations. Because at this point, what I'm trying to think of now is like, okay, what is science? What is like medical research? What are these? How can I relate these things to more interesting visual cues? So part of your job, or my job as an illustrator or a creative thinker, is to also just think, how can I make, you know, new steps, that new visual like connections to things that people might not be expecting. So when I'm looking at this stuff, for example, I can see a relationship in this original geological rock pattern and the way that it like layers in space to like a physical space like this, where it moves backwards and creates visual depth with colors like changing. I think this is, I can't remember what this is. It's again just like an organic molecular image that has layering and color references that I might use later. So these are the sort of things that I would take a look at to see how can I use this aesthetically in my final illustration. Colors like photographs of galaxies, again, more like scientific art. How can the relationship of these colors kind of work into my illustration and drawing style? And what kind of conceptual things can I pull from these images that I can reuse later in my sketches? These are the questions that I'm asking myself at the beginning. So for this project, I think I ended up doing about 25 sketches and revisions, and I'm just going to share all of them with you guys as I talk. Again, when I get to the sketching stage, I kind of believe in not going like with a fully finished image that gives the art director or the creative director too much information, because you want a little bit of room in your artwork to have like room to explore like actual artistic choices and not just like the choices that are being made for the sake of the illustration. Because my philosophy on this stuff is that you want to make an illustration that you would also be happy to like hang as artwork in your home, right? It shouldn't just serve the article, it should serve the audience. So I think about these things in a lot of different ways. So when I was thinking about this article, which is talking about research and talking about exploration and learning new things, I started to think about how the images that I researched and associate with science and learning could be reapplied to talk about this idea of exploration. So for me, I thought about like caves or the reflecting light, and how that can move inward and how it can create depth, and it can create like this mysterious image that kind of relates to exploration or unknown stuff, but without telling too much of the story of science or medical or geological elements. I thought about how if you put a person into these different like aesthetic choices, how you can make more interesting patterns that don't necessarily like need all of those visual cliches that we looked at in the like research, but instead make a more interesting image that kind of allows the viewer to tell part of, invent part of the story on their own as well, which I think is a really big part of illustration. Is like we've gotten very reliant on telling too much of a narrative and not enough like confidence that our audience can make some of the connections for us. And I think that when you make art like that doesn't tell the whole story, it gives the audience a lot more room to sort of interact and think about it. So you can see here, I'm like making like now textural choices that could relate to the cave or relate to the galaxy or the black hole, but then I have like new connections being made with perspective and depth. So again, this is like where I'm starting to think about, okay, how can this physical space be manipulated and give the viewer something new and surreal, but still tell the story that the article is presenting? How can I rely on those different visual elements to solve the problem, but then also allow myself a little room to make artistic and interesting like choices with media, mixed media. For example, on this, I was thinking it would be really cool if they chose the sketch to apply some of these textural things that I saw in my research to the background, but recreate them with paint or watercolor or ink, for example. And a lot of these, I was thinking about the fact that the article is called 11 Things We Know, or We'd Like to Know. And so I would layer up these different layers of like abstract elements to kind of reiterate the fact that there's a bunch of different elements to the story. And again, this is all part of my brainstorming process, right? So it doesn't just have to be like, I can start with this, but then in Photoshop, allow myself to make it more insane or abstract, or try different ways of layering those items. I was really like into the idea of trying to figure out how to layer things and make a surreal image that gave us multiple dimensions or multiple like venues of space or compositional choices that sort of gave the viewer something unexpected. So using frames and like interior space to give depth and sort of disorientate the viewer. Some of these sketches obviously are not as good as others. I was also thinking about just having like the 11 elements cycling around the figure's head to make it sort of like a mysterious, almost three-dimensional quality to it. Because with all of these choices, I think as an artist and illustrator, you want to solve the problem, but you also want to have the final art be fun to make. And for me at this point, I think I'm constantly trying to find ways that I can use mixed media experiments or experiments with paint or scanning or digital combinations of things to tell stories in a more interesting way, and not just rely on the concept in terms of like whatever the metaphor is, but also what the aesthetic choices can do for your concept. So in this case, like, I think there's a long tradition, especially in illustration, to just either tell the narrative of the story through a scene or try to solve the problem by combining two different elements that maybe tell a new story. But in my case, I think that there's like this new way of thinking about illustration that also has to do with what media and what aesthetic choices you're making as well. So you can see, like, on this one, I have the illustration of the head, but then I'm trying to tangle it with the figure who's exploring it, right? I also started to think about how these things like could become more like physical objects that an explorer or scientist is kind of looking at abstractly. So I became interested in the idea of like light pouring over our subject matter and sort of abstracting the stuff around them. You can see that these are similar sketches, but one has more of a mystery and more of an eeriness to it, which I really like to explore with my work. And then again, just like going back, so if I have an image that is like this, I might think, okay, how can I use this rotating, like sort of blob-like substance in different compositional choices like this? So it's just repeating different ideas and kind of finding the right balance that I'm looking for. And as I'm going through these, I'm also considering, you know, the art director is going to be the one who ultimately makes the choice here. So I like to give a lot of variety in my sketches and not, you know, curate myself too much, because I like to treat the art director confidently and know that they have like a different perspective on where all of this is going to go. So it's important, I think, to be able to be open to like working with them. You can see that with these later sketches, I was working with like texture and sort of layering to make more depth and more lighting, and I kind of realized that this is going to be the direction of the project I hope, you know, it moves in. I started to think about those physical cave spaces and like the geographical element, or I'm sorry, geological elements that I looked at and how they layered and how that could be applied to a human element to my illustration. And what I was mentioning earlier is that I think, you know, we looked at the stock illustration at the beginning that had the profile of the head. And in that profile of the head, we saw a lot of scientific elements. What I was trying to do is relate the figurative human element to this with the figure or with the outline of the head, but then figure out how I could abstract what was happening in the center to give a more like loose narrative of an interpretation of the subject matter in the story. Thinking about light. And then I had this idea to combine the flat spaces and move them visually inwards so that we get like this really disorientating, exploring feel. But when you put it into the profile of the head, it kind of relates to thinking and critical thinking and ingenuity. So I'm just combining ideas that I kind of brainstormed earlier and trying to refine them. This is a refinement of that sketch. You can see that now the head is layering in itself, so it gives us the impression of like critical thinking or deep thought. And then you can also see that I've started to think about how I can incorporate actual photography of outer space into my illustration to allude to the subject matter, but again, not tell too much of the narrative or give too much away, because what you really want to do is engage the viewer enough to make them want to read the article, not give them all the information in your illustration so that they don't feel like reading the article is necessary. And this is the final cover that I came up with. You can see that through the course of my research, I saw a lot of different color elements and conceptual elements that I thought I could apply to the final artwork. So we started with this version, and then I moved it inward. I borrowed a lot of colors and textural, stuff from my research, and stuff like the galaxy in the background I recreated with airbrushes and spray paint. The head is made out of acrylic paint. And then I have like these two figures and they're looking at each other through this dense space. This was the original that I mocked up, and because the way that stuff is printed, you know, it has to be a little bit lighter. So this is what I wanted to do, a higher contrast, more dramatic image. You can see that there's like color options. So from start to finish, that's how I like kind of approach my conceptual thinking with my editorial artwork. I think it's really important to be open to new ways of thinking about how you approach this stuff and not just rely on, you know, whatever visual cues are given directly to you in the article. For example, the associations that we have with science are maybe very cliched, but thinking outside the box and reapproaching the way that you do your conceptual and artistic choices can lead to more interesting artwork in the end. And that's kind of what I wanted to share with you guys today. I don't have anything else to present, but I would like to answer any questions or talk to you about any questions that you have about any of that, if anybody would like to ask anything.
Oh, that's pretty interesting, Daniel. Pretty interesting work. So we have one question over here. So
Okay.
When you start your conceptual process, what are you thinking? Do you have something in mind before going and sketching and mixing up different things?
Yeah, I couldn't find that, you know, because that project was a year and a half old or whatever, I couldn't find the original sketchbook. But even before the research of like imagery or sketching, I'll just take the entire article and I'll write down the words from the article that I can like find some sort of interest or connection to with my own work. So for example, when I looked at the original brief, it talks about a variety of things that I kind of like wrote down and then made visual connections to. For example, why will we survive in a hotter world? So if I isolate just that text, will we survive in a hotter world, I can think about heat or like the way that heat is visualized in the desert or those sort of things. You can think about like the sentence, "We are not alone. How the heck are we going to meet aliens?" So you think about the idea of loneliness and isolation in that sentence and then how it connects to the greater article. So a lot of it is like just brainstorming based on just words and making initial connections to the words that are given through visual language, like visual cues. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, kind of, yes, it does make sense. Okay, so we have another question. So,
Okay.
so you work with different mediums, right? So you mix and match. Do you work with traditional mediums as well?
Yeah. Yeah. For this science cover, you know, with a lot of my editorial work, I am trying to recreate what I make in my painting studio digitally. So for example, I've spent a lot of time figuring out how I can recreate the way that acrylic paint flattens with like flat colors and how I can build it up in Photoshop and recreate it so it looks like my paintings in real life. And the reason I do that is because with a project like the New York Times cover, you may have 2 or 3 days to work on it total. And when it comes to editing and things and like perfecting the image, I've found over time that I can make really great paintings and work that I'm proud of, physical work that I'm proud of in my studio if I have the time and sort of space to do it. But when it comes to something with like a deadline, I think it can be like I've found for me personally that working digitally on illustration projects and recreating my physical like language helps a lot because it gives me a little bit more opportunity to edit and refine stuff.
Okay, so that sounds interesting. So when you're working with your illustrations, do you actually try to when you mix and match? So do you take some inspirations from somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to like when I look at what already exists, I do draw from like what kind of symbolic language is used and draw from that. But in terms of my aesthetic choices, I'm always trying to kind of push those into new directions and not necessarily look at one artist or illustrator for reference in that way, and more or less just try to accept the way that I draw or create things and then combine them into new and interesting ways.
So when you're working for a client, for instance, Nike or Google, so do they give you room to explore? Or
I've been very lucky, especially with like clients like Nike and Adidas. There's a lot more room for exploration, and they're surprised. I mean, I don't know if it's always like this, but with those projects, my experience was that they were very open to my interpretations of, you know, the creative brief. So I was lucky in that way.
okay, so that's interesting. Any biggest challenge that you faced while working for a client?
I think the biggest, probably, let's see, there's a lot of challenges. I think that for me, it's always trying to find a balance of something that's provocative and new and like fresh, while still understanding that a lot of these clients have specific things that they're trying to accomplish with whatever they're promoting or representing with the illustration. So I think the biggest challenge is kind of pushing yourself into new directions while still like problem solving for clients, which is maybe the biggest challenge in illustration artistically for me is you know, I would say. Yeah, that's the biggest challenge, I would say.
Would you be able to share any work that you did for Nike or Google, for instance, right now?
Yeah, I can. Let me see. Hold on one second. Because if you look at the Google stuff, it's dramatically different. The stuff I did for Google wasn't like emojis, so they have more of like a humorous element to them. Yeah, let me see if I can pull it up. I have to look.
Afreen, there are some questions in the chat box as well.
Yeah, feel free to ask while I look at my screen. Sorry.
Yes, we have one question. We see that you use a lot of texture in your design. Do they relate with your thought process, conceptual process, or do they relate to design more?
So the question is, does the textural elements relate more to the process or to the conceptual side? Is that correct?
Come again, please.
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. So we see that you use a lot of textures in your design. Do they relate with your thought process or your conceptual process, or do they relate to design more?
For me, like the inspiration that I draw from is a lot of very organic, handmade, like artwork that has a lot of physicality. I think that I like to relate that into my own illustration work, and I can use textural elements to emphasize and push, you know, these conceptual choices. But for me, it's just kind of how I make the work. So it doesn't necessarily have to do. It can enhance the conceptual choices, but I think it's more of just an aesthetic choice. I have this. Let me open. I have a sample to share of this Google. So this is just going to be like an animated GIF, but it shows the 36 stickers I made for Google. So let me share that with you. Can you see this?
Not right now. I think something is coming up yet. Oh, we do see something. But that's for Halloween.
Yeah, so these were a series of stickers that I made for Google for Halloween. And you can see that they wanted me to develop different characters and humorous characteristics to these elements that are normally thought of being kind of scary, and then make something that communicates to the viewer. So these are just stickers, right? And you can see that there's a similarity between this and the artwork that I made for the New York Times Science cover in terms of like the color choices and textural choices. But with these, I really had to simplify them down so that they could read at a much smaller level.
You have a very big effect that you're using in most of your work. It's like a street painting, graffiti painting in your work. So do you use that specifically? Because it looks like spray paint.
Yeah, I use a lot of aerosol and airbrush and spray paint in my work. And being in New York, there's a lot, obviously, I mean, if you've been to New York, you know there's graffiti everywhere, and that's a very big like visual inspiration for me, especially because I feel like in New York especially, it's probably the best in the world. So I see a lot of that actively every day walking around, and I've become very like aware of it in my day-to-day life. So yeah, the texture of that is spray paint or aerosol, but then I've figured out how to recreate it in Photoshop. with brushes and stuff.
So do you, let me just read the question out right now. So what is your most favorite project that you worked upon, and why is that your most favorite project?
The one that I shared, or you just in general? Which one is your favorite in general?
Yeah, in general, and if you could share that with us, that would be lovely.
Okay, I'll have to think about that. What would it be? I mean, any time that I get to work for the New York Times, it's like a pretty big honor. I got to do this New Yorker illustration last year that I can pull up for a review of. I don't know how popular The Handmaid's Tale is in Pakistan, but here it's a big, popular TV show and book, and I got to do a book review. The Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, okay.
By Margaret Atwood, and she came out with a sequel to that book last year, and I got to do the book review cover for it for the New Yorker, and I'm trying to pull it up right now. I can't find it right off the bat, sorry. But that was the thing that I most enjoyed, I think, in recent memory, just because it was a very big, like, had cultural importance in America. So yeah.
Okay, could you be able to share that with us right now? Is that
I'm
possible?
trying to find it, but for some reason it's not coming quickly. So give me 1 second.
Oh,
do you have any other questions right now?
Yeah. Meanwhile, I can keep on asking you more questions.
Okay,
So,
great.
There's a question right here. Should I read it out?
yeah, I'm just looking at them right now. So how much responsibility should the illustrator feel for effectively conveying the narrative, especially for works of abstract nature?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
How much responsibility should the illustrator feel for effectively conveying the narrative, especially for works of abstract nature?
My opinion of that is that there's way too much focus on creating illustration and artwork that is conceptually smart or clever, and I think that it really takes away from a lot of the room for exploration as artists that we should feel, that we should have as creative thinkers and people who want to explore work in interesting aesthetic ways. So for me, I think it's a little bit overrated to think too much about the concept and not about the aesthetic choices or abstraction. So for me, abstraction is a really important element to it. Let me see here. Okay, so here's I was trying to find the full spread for this, but I couldn't, but I'll just share my window. So this is the illustration for The Handmaids for the New Yorker. And it was this illustration where they needed me to focus on like surveillance of the characters in the book, and also just kind of like the eeriness of surveillance. So that's why I like this project a lot, is because I had to deal with like a lot of heavy issues, but they gave me a lot of room to explore with just like the composition and sort of like scary aspect of it to make it feel more like it's a socially conscious narrative, but I got to make it more feel like a horror movie poster or something. So that was a fun project.
It's really cool. Okay, so we have one more question. How can one keep oneself motivated to regularly create creative content, either for client or personal projects?
So the question is how to stay motivated and for creative purposes, right?
Yeah. So how can you keep yourself motivated for regularly to keep creating creative work, either it's for a client or a personal project anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I find for me that, and I think this probably goes for a lot of creative thinkers and people who make art, is that there'll be periods of time where I'm extremely creative and have really great ideas and can work for 8 hours straight on something, and there's other days where I wake up and it's just like, it seems impossible. And I think that that's a really common thing with creative thinkers. So for me, I think it's knowing how to step away from projects and accept that you're not always going to be making the best art. You're not always going to be thinking the most clearly, and that it's okay to embrace like time where you can just watch movies or read books or look at other people's artwork, or just create artwork like that has no purpose other than being enjoyable to make. So for example, especially being in like quarantine for the past 4 months, we've gotten to go out a little bit more flexibly in the last few weeks, but I was making a lot of crafts. I was doing a lot of like carving wood and making things with my hands and just painting abstractly in our house. And I think that allowing yourself to make work that is just fun to make for your, without having any sort of like conceptual or intellectual purpose can be really gratifying as well. So I would recommend just like always actively consuming or making art, even if it's not to share, but just to make sure that you're, keeping your brain fresh would be my advice.
That's a good advice.
Yeah.
That's a good advice. Often our students, they keep looking for inspirations and they don't actually, they get stuck or they're blocked. So
Right.
they keep asking us. So I know that you've been to that stage as well, and now you are a renowned designer. So what advice would you want to give them at this stage?
So at this stage, I think it's really, I think the value of being in school and getting an education, design or art education, is that you have the opportunity to make big purchases that you might not be able to make later in your career or make as often. So my advice to people in school right now is to continue like pushing what you make to new and unexpected places and allowing yourself to make mistakes, because I think the biggest problem that I see with students, especially at like the classes I teach at Queens College here in Brooklyn or in Queens, is that people want to be safe and they want to keep things conservative and they don't want to they don't want to push things. They want to just create things that have already been made or like kind of recreate ideas that have already been developed. But school, I think especially, is the time to really try to think outside of those restrictions and think about things in a more like intellectual grand way, because you might not have that opportunity later. But I think also when you think about your approaches to work and the fact that school you can fail and it's not like a financial like problem, or it's not like a career problem, you're failing in a good way because you're learning from it. I think that my advice would be to just try to push things way beyond what people are expecting in school, because it's the best time to do that.
I think I'm going to cut and clip this portion of your talk and I'm going to paste it all over in all our classes, because they really need this talk. That's one thing that, yes, they keep on being safe and they don't want to explore, and they sometimes get scared. So we always trying to tell them that it's okay to be scared, but they need to explore at the same time.
Yeah, because I think as students, you're looking at what people have done and succeeded with already. So we all have these references of like who the best artists are, who the best designers are, who the best illustrators are. And when you just kind of like use those as references to recreate in school, all you're doing is just repeating the same narrative and you're not adding to it. So I think it's important to, use the opportunity that school affords you to push those boundaries really far, because you're not failing in any way other than, maybe wasting a little bit of time, but it's not a waste of time if you're learning from it.
So there's another question. How designers should position themselves in the market where there are better chances to get bigger clients?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge, especially, even living in New York. I think like it makes it easier to get big clients, but with social media, I think, it's given us some opportunities to share work more broadly and more globally. But in terms of getting those bigger clients, it's really about just actively working. So I think that for me, it was just the fact that I'm constantly, if I'm not working on editorial work, then I'm working on paintings. And if I'm not working on paintings, then I'm working on like new ideas for illustrations or printmaking or whatever, and just showing that you're actively participating as an artist and not just doing it when it pays. And so I think like a big part of getting work is just visualizing yourself and as an artist who's constantly trying to look for work and not just doing it when the work comes in, if that makes sense.
Oh, okay. So let me just post another question directly onto you right now. So do you think your work is more towards the abstract and explorative side, or is that consciously done?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
So do you think your work is more towards the abstract and explorative side, or is that consciously done?
I think it's hard. It's hard to say. I think it is consciously done more now, where I'm trying to actively avoid like any sort of illustration cliches. Sometimes it's not possible because of the client or the time or whatever. But for me, it's a conscious decision to try to make things a little bit more unexpected in my artwork.
Okay, so do you ever get burnt out with the deadlines?
Yeah, I mean deadlines. Yeah, I do all the time. Sometimes it's like something with the New York Times, especially. There may be a 24-hour deadline or something, and sometimes that can be like really invigorating because it's like you do it and then you're done, and it's like you've accomplished an illustration in a day. Other times it can just be like I'll get the email and I'm just like dreading it because it really is a mentally straining thing on a day where you have to conceive and finish a piece of art maybe in one day. It feels like running a marathon sometimes. At the same time, it's like whenever I'm given 4 weeks to work on a project, I usually procrastinate until the last week. So sometimes those like deadlines can be really effective and helpful, you know.
Oh, okay. Do you keep up with new illustration trends? If so, then how?
I have to say that, like, for me, I've almost completely stopped looking at illustration trends in terms of looking at illustration blogs or keeping up with what's like trending or whatever on Pinterest, let's say. And I've really embraced looking at the things that I appreciate as artwork as like my inspiration instead of what other illustrators are doing. So for example, like science fiction and like horror movies I'm really into, and I've tried to figure out how I can apply those sort of aesthetic things that like a movie director might like apply to my artwork instead of worrying about what like the illustration world would do to solve the same problem, if that makes sense.
Can you come again? I think, can you just say that again, the last part?
Yeah, I instead of looking at like the trends of illustration, I look more like inward and more introspectively into like what I appreciate in visual art. So it's like movies are a big part of my like visual language, and I really like looking at movies and film, especially like horror movies and science fiction movies for inspiration, because there's all these textural and lighting and aesthetic choices that those types of movies make that I find really interesting, that I then try to apply to my illustration work instead of like looking at whatever contemporary illustration choices are being made.
So, what other artist expressions do you indulge in other than illustration? Since you said that you'd go look into movies as well. So, I see a lot of Star Wars inspiration in your work. So, but where else do you look at for inspiration?
I mean, even when I was in Islamabad, I was like really excited to go to like the bookstores there, because I feel like I wish I could remember the bookstore that we were taken to, but a giant bookstore in Islamabad that I'm sure you guys are familiar with. I always use like used bookstores and flea markets and sort of antique stores as reference. So I will spend a lot of time like digging through old books or old magazines and seeing like how was a diagram about some specific thing illustrated 100 years ago, and how can I use that as like a visual reference now. So those sort of things. So a lot of it is also just looking at old books and old magazines and old print ephemera, because I think there's a lot of stuff that, you know, is not embraced as important works of like visual art, but like it still exists in a way that can be in like isolation, could be very inspirational. So a lot of it is, yeah, just like old books and things like that.
I actually have a question related to printmaking. You said you also do that. So how do you think that helps you with your illustrations? Because with printmaking, you know, you get a very like a black and white or 2 to 3 tones or maybe even more. But does that really help your creative process?
Yeah, for sure. And like with the block printing and woodcut stuff, I think I always look at that. You know, those are pieces of art, but they are kind of design problems that you need to solve, especially a black and white print, because you have to find a balance like design principles like balanced within the work. So for example like positive and negative forms, contrast, you know, making like a clear image with just one color. So for me, like printmaking especially like informs a lot of the lighting choices that I make in my full color artwork, where I can, if you can make an illustration that works as just black and white and the light works and the contrast works, and then you can add color to it, you can think about your illustrations just as one color to start. Like all of the sketches that I shared are one color, for example, and it allows you to think more critically about how clearly your image is going to work. So I think that printmaking does play a big role in how I kind of problem solve and conceptualize like the compositions of my illustrations and paintings and stuff.
Okay, great, thanks.
So how important do you think is consistency in your work?
I think consistency and style are probably very overrated. To me personally, I think that the artists and illustrators and designers that I admire most are the ones who, if you look at their work from 3 years ago, it looks nothing like it does now. So I think that change and evolution of an artist is really important to me personally. I think that that's not going to be for everyone, because some people, you know, are relied on for their style. So it's kind of an artistic choice that I make consciously, but I think some people can benefit from having a specific style and not changing it. It just kind of depends on what you're looking for. Because for me, I'm looking in my career at this point as more of like what the next challenge is going to be, not how I'm going to solve the illustration in the same way that I've done it 20 other times before.
Yeah. So before I, wrap up the chat, I just want to ask you that, is there any other work that you would like to show to our students that could be an eye-opener for them, interesting to look at as well?
I mean, I can show you. Yeah, I mean, and also I can just go, the easiest way to do that is just to kind of go, and if I look at my website, I can show you examples of things that just a few examples of things where I had, some sort of visual aha moment. So for example, we were talking about, can you see this?
Not right now. Something is coming up. Yes. We can't actually.
You can't see anything?
I can see it actually. After
you can?
Yeah.
Wait, I'm
just telling you. Yeah, it's happening.
Okay, so if I look at images like this image for the New York Times, this was a really fun image that allowed me to think more abstractly about the different elements that were covered in the story. So this was for an illustration. This was an illustration for an article about finding like computer glitches and bugs in digital games. So in this case, it was about how the crossword puzzle app on the New York Times website had gotten a bug, and they couldn't figure out how to solve the bug so that it wouldn't keep on making the same error. And for me, this was such a great opportunity to take the textural elements of a crossword puzzle. Are you familiar with this? I don't know if they have these in Pakistan or not, but
yeah, we are familiar with it.
Yeah, okay. So it's like I really think that like abstractly a crossword puzzle is a very interesting like looking thing, because it's just checkers, but then they're not consistent, right? So every crossword puzzle you look at has a different composition to it, and abstractly that's a really interesting idea to me. So by moving this like physical bug through that space and using the black negative space as a physical element, not just a flat one, for me this was like a really fun project, because it allowed me to think about how to use the pre-existing crossword puzzle in an abstract way and make a physical space out of it. So that was one example I thought of off the bat. In this one, it was about like digital hacking and sort of like how people are being tracked across like different countries. So I made like a physical wall, but the physical wall is meant to represent like digital information or like passing through digital space. So in this one, I use that like airbrush or spray paint texture as a way to light it, I'll find one more example. Oh, so this is like, again, another fun New York Times illustration that was based around how zebras' stripes, scientists now think that zebra stripes are, a biological thing that are meant to keep flies away from biting them. So it was just a really fun project where I got to use the texture of a zebra and then relate it to like insects. And let's see, let's find one more. This was a project that I did in Brooklyn for Adidas, and you can see that it was I didn't paint the mural, but someone else did it for me. But the artwork is mine, and this was a fun project that they allowed me to do whatever I wanted because. So in this case, it was about like a new product for Adidas that was based around jogging at night, and I got to sort of equate like dripping paint and smoke and fog and stuff and incorporate with these figures that are running so that they almost disappear into like the aesthetics of the nighttime city. So those are just a few, I don't know, those are a few things that I wanted to share with you guys, but you can see there's a lot on here, so.
That is pretty interesting work that we are seeing. So how you're able to emotionally connect with your design when you're being paid to do it?
Yeah, that's a challenge. I mean, sometimes it's impossible. You'll get like a project that you have no, personal attachment to. You have no sort of intellectual attachment to it. It might be a very boring story. I've accomplished that more than a few times where it's just like not a very well-written story and it's not a very interesting subject matter. And in that case, I think what you have to do is sort of push yourself to figure out how you can then problem solve in a way that makes it interesting. So for example, if it's about like financial issues, I tend to not really like illustrating things about financing or stock trading or any sort of like projects that are based around money, because money is a very hard thing to visualize without showing physical money, obviously, or like gold, for example. But then it can be fun challenge to kind of think, okay, how can I abstractly relate the idea of wealth or money or finances in a way that doesn't show those things. So it can still be an interesting way to push yourself, even if they don't choose these more interesting ideas. It's still an interesting problem solving exercise.
So when you're working on your ideas, genuine and original ideas can exist when all our brains are constantly being bombarded with ideas from Google, Pinterest, or any search engine. Isn't it impossible to escape influence?
Yeah, I mean, I don't recommend looking at those things for like visual, like instructional learning. I think I look at them more as a way to see what to avoid. So I think that it is impossible, especially if you're looking at like Instagram a lot or like any website that has just a bombardment of imagery, like Pinterest, for example. I don't know that it necessarily functions in a positive way when you're just like inundating yourself with other people's work, because I think it's really important for an artist or a designer or illustrator to be able to process artwork and look at it and like ingest it. So for example, when you go to a museum, you're not really getting anything if you just run as fast as you can through the museum and look at every single thing. It's the exact same thing as just like scrolling through Instagram and looking at a million things at once. So I think slowing down and really like critiquing every single image that you come in contact with and why it's successful or why it's not is a really important thing to do.
So there's another question. I know that you might start laughing on this one, but do you look at memes for inspiration?
Do I look at memes?
Yeah.
No, not really.
Okay, so that sums it up. So this is not related to what we are talking about right now. So, but is there any is your philosophical vision that you want to apply to the society while you're designing?
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, I think like as an artist, you do need to interact with culture and society in a way that's engaging. I don't know if it's also just a career choice, you know? So I think there has to be a balance between giving the audience something that's unexpected and communicates clearly, but also not doing it in a way that isolates your viewer, and also you have to make sure that you're like just making an income off of it. So I'm trying to balance that stuff. But as I get older, I've found that I've cared less about like financial success and more about like intellectual and artistic success. In other words, like finding you know, new ways to think about and problem solve is more important to me now. And I think that that intellectually gives back to society.
So there's a lot going on right now around the globe, and almost everybody is in the same boat, no matter from where they belong. Does that were you able to produce any design that is inspired from the current situation?
You know, when all of this started, it was like it was hard not to, you know, focus on it constantly. And I'm talking back in March for us in the United States. I guess you could call it lucky. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it, because I have pretty traditionally dark artwork, and my style lends itself to the current moment in the world, global, whatever climate you want to, how you want to describe it. So for the first 2 months, I think it was probably the busiest I've been as an illustrator in a few years. I was just constantly getting projects based around COVID-19 or digital tracing or all of the other things that are happening. So at first it was great. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay. So your voice disappeared.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Oh, do you remember what the last thing I said was?
COVID-19.
Yeah, so it's like with the COVID-19, like all of that stuff, there were a lot of opportunities at the beginning that lent themselves to my style of artwork. It's been a little bit, you know, it's hard to predict what is going to be happening next in the like design and illustration world, but in terms of making work related to the current climate, I've made like I think 15 or 16 illustrations about it since it started.
So could you? I hope that I'm not asking much, but would you be able to show us some of it?
Yeah, I mean, I can show you. Just if I go back, I can just show you specifically on my website things that are pulled from this. So, for example, I haven't updated my website in a while because I've been trying to focus on other things, but this illustration was made for MIT Technology Review.
Wait, okay, everybody can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was about just tracing like your digital contacts and who you've come in contact with. And the concept of this, I don't know how obvious it is, but it's just about making connections between every person you've talked to and connected to, and then the odds that they have the virus. So you can see that I illustrated that by changing the color of some of those, like if you want to call them hits or interactions, the little circular elements. Some of them are green to just show that you can very quickly come into contact with someone with the virus, for example. This was like a similar concept for a different client, but this is just about how people are being traced digitally right now. This was the first illustration I made about the coronavirus, and it was for the International New York Times. And the idea here was that how quickly the virus can spread in public. So you can see that the circular elements that are repeating move outward, and the places that they move into the negative space is just how they move throughout the crowd. So the people that are filled in with black aren't affected by it, but you can see that they quickly will be as it radiates outward. Yeah, I think those are the most recent examples that I have there. And then this was more of like an illustration about how this current moment is isolating us. So it's all about like screen time, right? And then finally, this was one that I made just for fun about how I feel right now in this current climate. So you can see that my brain and my physicality is structurally there, but my thought process in my head is shrunken down because everything is like isolating and sort of dramatic right now.
We see, so there's a lot of dystopian feel to your work.
Yes.
So, yeah, do you want to comment on that?
Do I? You know, I think that I try to stay positive with images like this, but for me, like that feeling of like dystopia and isolation is, yeah, maybe I haven't thought about it in an intellectual way really, but I think that is something I think about a lot. And there's a lot of existentialism, I think, in my work, and yeah, you know, I forgot about this illustration. This is another coronavirus illustration where it was, I mean, I think it's probably obvious, but it was just talking about how religious people that are isolated have been self-quarantining for a very long time. And so this was just about the perspective of like a nun in the United States writing about isolation and the coronavirus. But in terms of what you were talking about, like dystopian elements, you know, it's a huge part of my work. I think that, like, you know, with this illustration of Hillary Clinton, I was asked to kind of illustrate the idea that like this negative political influence sort of, and so how to do that is I figured out how to do it with like computer glitching and that kind of texture. So yeah, it is something that I'm constantly thinking about, just like how society and politics and like all of this stuff affects us mentally and emotionally. It's a big part of my work. Are there any other questions? Afreen, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I thought that I was mute, so I'm sorry. I was
Okay.
talking. I didn't realize that you can't hear me. So okay, so you work with your own name, but should a designer work with his or her own name, or making a design agency, or working with a design agency is better, or making their own startup design agency is better?
It's hard for me to answer that question because I think, like, for me personally, having a name is associated with having like a brand or something. So I think when I think of like a studio practice that you may want to create, that would be like the purpose of that, having like a different name, like for your studio or whatever. The purpose would be to show that you're capable of a lot of different approaches to things. And in my case, that's more of a hyper specific thing, which is why I kind of keep my own name attached to it.
Okay. So, so you came to Pakistan last year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that there are two different worlds, but what did you thought about the design world, since you specifically attend the design conference happened in Islamabad? So what did you thought of this world of design?
Yeah, I was really impressed. I think we all were really impressed by the community of people there, and especially, you know, in the area where I got to interact with all of the illustration students. I think that was the work I was most impressed by because it had a lot of variety, and I wasn't able to talk to all of the people who had their illustration booths there, but the people that I talked to seemed to really be like speaking in, you know, their own unique voices, and I was really impressed by that. And you know, I wish we had more time in Pakistan because I didn't get to go to Lahore, we didn't go to Karachi, we were only in Islamabad, and I know that like I wish I could have seen more of it because I know that like in Lahore there's a very big, is it Lahore or Karachi where there's a big art scene?
Karachi is the biggest one.
Karachi, yeah. So I hope I can come back someday and see more of it, because I know that I was talking to Saad, Saad is one of the speakers. I was talking to him and his wife Mooney about like her being in the art world, and it seemed very engaging, and I hope to come back someday is all I'm saying. If you want to bring me back, I'll come back.
That's good to hear. I think after this COVID, we would try to bring you back.
Okay, awesome. I'll be there.
Before, so this has been a very interesting session, and before I start to wrap up, I just wanted to ask one more question, or any advice to a young illustrator who are listening to you right now.
Yeah, my advice is speak from your heart and make work that you're proud of, and don't rely on the work of other people to inform what you make. Think about what interests you personally and create the work that reflects that honestly to the world. I think the biggest disservice you can do as a young illustrator is mimic or try to replicate things that you view as successful, because I think those things already exist, and it's your job now to, you know, inform the world in new and more interesting ways. So my advice is to use your own inspiration and your own like visual language, and think for yourself, and kind of give us something new instead of relying on what other people have done.
Okay, so thank you so much, Daniel. It was lovely listening to you. It was a lovely session, and I hope. Okay, so there is another question, so I'm not going to disappoint the student right now.
Okay,
so do you think every work is just a remix of works before it?
Can you repeat that?
Okay, so the work that you've shown, so there's a question that you think that every work is just a remix of previous work?
I think that obviously, like, we, internalize everything we view, and we look at things, and we respond to them negatively or positively, depending on what our reaction is. Obviously, I think that your role as an artist is then to like take what you've like learned or ingested or viewed, and then apply what is positive about it in your own way. So I think, yeah, there is like this repetition and remixing of everything you viewed, but I think it's more of your responsibility to make it new and fresh instead of just recycling it.
Okay, so so thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much for taking out time and giving us lovely feedback. I think the students have enjoyed the session a lot. So let me just check if I've just left any questions or no. I think we are done for today. So we hope to. So I just wanna point out. I just wanna thank my team right here. And before I end up, I just want my HOD, if she could, say a few words, if it's possible for her. Miss Aisha Imdad, is that possible?
Thank you, Afreen. I think it was a very inspiring talk. Thank you, Daniel. We really appreciate that you took out your time and talk to our students, and I'm sure all our students also benefited fully from your talk and got inspired by the way you were explaining everything. I really enjoyed the visuals because as a printmaker, I myself can relate to the different textures that you were using in your visuals. They were really interesting, and they were bringing an exciting element in the design. Thank you so much. I hope that one day we can actually meet, and you can come to our department in reality and talk to our students, and we can have a conversation where we can all be together in the same room instead of Thank you.
Yeah, I hope the same thing. I hope that, I know that Pakistan has been especially hit hard by everything, so I hope everybody's doing okay. And I did want to say that when we were in Islamabad, it was one of the best trips I've had. So I really like it there, and I especially like the food and the people. So I miss Pakistan. I hope I can come back someday.
Yeah, that would be really great. We look forward to have that someday once the COVID times are over and we are all back to our normal lives. Hope so, if that it happens soon. Thank
Hopefully
you.
soon. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Ms. Aisha, and thank you, Daniel. Before I go, so I'm Afreen. I was in conversation with Daniel Zender all the way from Brooklyn, New York. I want to thank my team, Ms. Zara Hafiz, Amna Hashmi, Mizan Ali Mir, for helping us out in conducting a successful session yet again. I hope to see you guys next week at 10 o'clock. We have Gemma O'Brien all the way from Australia. So hope to see you guys Thursday, 9th July, 10 o'clock. And thank you, Daniel. Thank you for coming up. And we hope yet again. And it's actually very good to hear that you really love Pakistan. And so we hope to have you again someday.
Okay, awesome. That sounds great.
So we're going to wrap up our talk right now. I hope everybody gained a lot of positive insights from Daniel. Hope to see you guys next week. Allah Hafiz. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
So